Hello, welcome back. We're going to be looking into the Industrial Revolution today. So, excuse me if I look down with my notes, but nevertheless, the Industrial Revolution. Now, the video essentially took the questions on how Britain became the main industrial power and why it happened in Britain. So I'm not going to go over that since that's going to be rehashing what's already been stated in the video that was posted. So, what I'm going to move on to is a series of other in-depth questions and answering those questions. So, first off, what we have is how did industrialization spread from Great Britain to the European continent and America? Great Britain certainly had all the technology, the Industrial Revolution through the canals, the railroad, steam engine, manufacturing cotton, since that was their main industry at the time anyway. And so now everyone was looking abroad at Britain, realized some of the strengths of the industrial capacity, certainly mass manufacturing items, and of course through the trade empire that Britain had, they could beat out everybody's prices. So for example, the cotton industry, they could produce the wool, cotton, get all the raw material processed to actually be made into shirts or pants. And then, since they're mass producing at a much greater rate than anybody else can, and certainly much faster than they could beforehand, they could sell certainly these items at a much, much cheaper rate. So as a result, they can sell pants for a fraction of the cost of what France, for example, can sell pants or shirts. So certainly the impact there was they were driving business down, and in fact some of the businesses went out of business because they just couldn't compete with British prices. Certainly the other European countries wanted to get hold of some of this new technology. They didn't want to develop it on their own. They didn't want to reinvent the wheel. And so the first attempt, or a series of attempts that certainly the Europeans are going to do, is they're going to try see if they can get some of these Englishmen to teach them. The first thing that Britain is going to do is they realize that this could potentially be a national security situation. And so they don't allow the inventors or the machinists who know how to construct these machines from leaving Britain. They also don't want these inventions sold abroad. So until the 1820s, they really don't sell too many projects abroad. Now, this ban is going to be very difficult to enforce, and so it doesn't really work. So some of the English machinists and inventors do go overseas. They do make it over there. They are paid to construct steam engines or whatever other machine or technology the Europeans are interested in for a price, of course. So it does get spread throughout Europe through that. But also a more interesting aspect of it, I find, is that some of the Europeans went over to England and they went to their fairs, they went to certainly some of the expositions on steam engines and all these other machines, and they memorized, or they went to these inventors and they wanted to know how they worked, and so they memorized the entire machine, all the measurements, all the different pieces, all the different cogs that make these machines work. Then they would go back to their countries, could be the United States, could be France, or what would become Germany, and then they would write down on a piece of paper as fast as they can essentially what they had memorized, and then they would reconstruct the machine there. Now, sometimes this wouldn't work. Obviously, if their memory got it off maybe a few points, then the machine wouldn't really work to what it was designed to do. So to a point, this did work, but more or less, this information did seep out, and so the French, the Germans, and the United States would obtain this technology. And they would try to improve this technology. Now, after the 1820s and certainly in the 1840s, Britain realized that this information wasn't going to stay put in Great Britain. And so they tried to capitalize on this situation. So they started selling these machines on the open market to the United States, the French, the Germans, and everyone else who was interested in these machines. And so they got a pretty penny and quite a bit of profit off of this. And what in fact happened was, since they could mass produce these items, and this is going to be cloth items, but also machines, since these machines are building certainly the materials to make other machines. And then later on, when the British, as well as Americans, figure out how to develop steel by blowing cold air onto hot iron, the British are able to mass produce this much greater than anybody else. And so they sell all these machines at a cheaper price, and they make quite a bit of profit. And so the other countries aren't able to really catch up to Britain for quite some time, at least till the 1870s, 80s. So Britain has at least 100 years on everybody else. Now, some of the reactions for some of the European countries because of the industrialization of Britain is they're going to apply some tariffs to British goods. Certainly they're going to apply it to cloth. Now, what a tariff is essentially a tax on foreign goods. So if you're in France and there's some shirts that came across by Britain, they're going to be at a higher price due to the tax imposed by the French government. Now, that would normally work, but since Britain is producing these projects so cheaply, it really didn't affect their business too much. Alright, so let's see. Also, a couple additional points. While the British are focusing more on cotton production, the Germans and the French are focusing their efforts on coal and iron production, more of the industrial base. So their steam engines are going to be used in mines rather than, for example, making wool and cotton, those sort of factors. The Americans, when they get hold of industrialization, they're going to use it very much like the British, but also they're going to develop something that is very common today, standardization. Now, to us, that may seem a little odd and weird, but standardization was not common back in the 17 and 1800s. It would be left up to the Americans to develop that. Now, if you think about it, without standardization, essentially what standardization is everything that is made is of the same size, or is essentially the same thing, which is fairly common today. But back then, if you were to produce a hammer, a pot, a pan, a nail, they would all generally be of slightly different size. And for the most part, this isn't going to be too much of a problem. But where it comes into a big problem is when you talk about the military. For example, if you don't have standardization, every single bullet might be a different size. Now, when you get into artillery or rifles, that's going to be a big problem. Because now, when you try to load the weapon, maybe the bullet will fit into the barrel, maybe not. And then, certainly, manufacturing techniques are going to change the quality of the rifle. Maybe the rifle will have a longer barrel, maybe it won't have rifling to make it accurate. And so this creates a huge logistical nightmare. Just think if today, if we didn't have standardization, trying to equip tens of thousands of rifles that are different to all of our soldiers, it'd just be a mess. So the Americans are going to make molds to make everything basically the same. And so that's going to make everything easier, one, to manufacture, but two, to actually use out in the market. Think of today, if you're trying to do some crafts or do some repairs on the home, you're going to go to the store and you're going to buy maybe a box of nails, and they're all going to be exactly the same size. So this allows you to actually use that for many different projects instead of just one project. So standardization is certainly going to help the Americans really mass produce at a much greater rate, and then they also develop the moving assembly line. So this allows certainly the Americans to really catch up. Now, standardization is going to be borrowed by the British and later the French and the Germans. and many other European powers as well. But Americans, they're going to be the first ones who start off that standardization, and certainly the effects of standardization are felt throughout the world. You just can't get away from standardization today. All right, moving on. What were the economic, social, and cultural effects of the Industrial Revolution? First off, some of the economic effects of the Industrial Revolution, as I've kind of alluded to before this point, is everything's going to be much cheaper to produce. So now when you're mass producing, certainly pots and pans, for example, now everyone's going to be able to afford these pots and pans because the process is going to become cheaper and cheaper. You're going to be able to produce more products for a cheaper price and therefore sell them at a cheaper price too. And when there's more of them, that's going to drive the price down as well. And so now the wealthy, the growing middle class, and now the lower class can afford all these products. And that's going to fuel industrialization because that's more money coming to the pockets of these businesses. They're going to expand their business even further from that point onward. Also, what you're going to get is the workers in these factories. They're going to be men, they're going to be women, and there are going to be children working in these factories. And now the significant change is you're transitioning from skilled workers, which you have them taught and trained in a certain way, to now with machines you can train essentially anyone, maybe 5-10 minutes, and they are going to know how to work that machine. So now you can hire huge droves of individuals to work in these factories and produce these products. But now you also get the development of factories where people are going to a location to work instead of staying in the home making cloth, which was the cottage industry setup that had existed since essentially the beginning of time. So now people are having to walk or ride or eventually drive to work. So now everyone's going to a central location. And you can't just work on it at your own time. Now you're actually going to have to be on time. And so time is going to be a huge factor here too. Now you actually have to arrive on time. People are going to get watches so they know what time it is and when they need to be at work and when they're off work or when their breaks are, so on and so forth. So that's going to be a huge factor there. The concept of time really wasn't important to really anybody, but certainly railroads when they started being developed. So that certainly changes the huge makeup of the workers at the time, and certainly we see it here today. But one of the big factors also is when you're transitioning from a cottage industry to a factory sort of setup, is now workers are going to be more dependent on the economic conditions. For example, Great Depressions, recessions, that sort of thing. Because previously, you worked at home, you might be a farmer, you could keep what, for example, you produced, and then sell the rest on the market. If, for example, you needed more food, then you would just keep more food and then sell the rest. Now everyone is basing their wages off of these jobs at the factories. If the factory closes, or if there's a layoffs due to not selling much of the product, now all those workers are at the whim of the economy, whether it be a recession, depression, or the employer. So there's going to be a lot more dependent people on wages rather than a barter system or certainly what they're able to negotiate around town, and creates a much bigger global economy due to the Industrial Revolution and as well as the working conditions. Now working off of that, the working conditions of these factories are going to be dismal. They really don't care, and they don't really have too much incentive to make these machines safe. So it's very easy. One, these machines aren't going to be regulated like many machines are today. They don't have the safety features that we see today. And so maybe if you make a mistake or some of those safety features aren't in place, you might get hurt. And so it's very easy for individuals to maybe break a hand, finger, and debating on which industry you're actually in, maybe you'll lose a hand. There isn't really any workers' comp or any sort of compensation if an individual gets hurt either. Generally, they're going to be fired, and then they're going to find somebody else. Part of the advantage for the factory itself is, since you can train somebody in 5-10 minutes, you're not really going to be too concerned about losing a worker. And so workers, in a sense, get replaceable. This is certainly going to be a cause when we get later into the turn of the century, around 1900, for example. Then when you get into the Great Depression and so on, like that. So that's certainly going to be a drastic effort. So now families are going to be completely dependent on these factories, and certainly by 1900, at least half of the population of some of these European countries, if not more, which certainly in some cases is more than half, are going to be completely dependent on this wage earning system. Alright, let's see here. Alright, I think I addressed all the points I wanted to with that one. Alright. What was the relationship between the growth of industry and Britain's dominance in trade and imperial strength during the middle years of the 19th century? Basically, they are related. At this time, certainly Britain had the biggest seaborne navy as well as merchant marine in the world. They had more of the navy than any other country combined, and it's going to stay that way until World War II. And I believe this was mentioned in the video posted as well. So in the end, what you have is you have this huge merchant marine navy, and you have the Royal Navy itself also protecting these ships in their trading lanes, but also these ports. So they're securing the trade. And now when you're mass producing all these products, Britain, since it already has this emphasis on seaborne trade, they are able to trade with North America, places in South America, Europe, India, as well as China. Now, they don't have any colonies in South America, but they've established a pretty good rap on trade in that area anyway. And so, because they have colonies initially in North America, they certainly have Canada for quite some time after the American colonies have their revolution. They have colonies, for example, in India and Africa, and they also have connections in China. So with this vast seaborne trading empire, they're able to grab goods from essentially every point of the empire, bring them back to Britain, and then sell them to the British themselves as well. And then, of course, to the Europeans. So they already have this working trading network, and industrialization is just going to enhance that. And also, with this trade, they're going to be trading with all these groups abroad as well. So this makes the British wealthier, makes them think they're also at the top of the world, and at the peak of their technological advance, which in some cases they certainly is true. But industrialization is certainly going to hurt the Indians, because their main industry is going to be cotton, very much what the British are interested in. But due to industrialization, they can outcompete, and essentially they do destroy the Indian economy. And so many of the cloth makers are going to be driven out of business. And that's certainly going to play into why the Indians are going to be such a poor society, is because the British and their industry just destroys the skills that they have developed over the hundreds and thousands of years. That industry is going to be completely destroyed by machines and an industrial revolution. So now they can't compete with these prices, and therefore they have to find new ways to make an income. For the most part, it's going to be producing cotton to sell to the British. And so many of the upper class are going to then start becoming part of British society there too, just because there isn't really too much of an option now anymore. Alright, let's see, what other points? Alright, since they have this navy and this trading network, and this industrialization, they're able to mass produce. They're able to keep ahead of the curve in producing ships, even more advanced ships, using these machines and more advanced technology. Repairing these ships are going to be easier, and you're going to start to see the transition, certainly in the 1850s and 60s, to all-metal design, which, since the British are at the forefront of steel and also producing at a much greater rate, they're able to keep ahead of the curve than anyone else in the world for quite some time. Like was mentioned, they're going to stay as a main power in the world until after World War II, which of course the Americans are going to take over. But since they have this trade network, they have this navy, they're able to exploit and certainly take advantage of industrialization. Without this wide-ranging navy and sea presence, they never would have really been able to capitalize on industrialization. Since they have their hands dipped in pretty much every single part of the world at this time, they're able to really take advantage of it and remain on top for quite some time. The profits, the wealth, the influence around the world is just unprecedented in the world today. Now, certainly some of the long-term effects of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution certainly is going to allow the British to remain on top of the world until World War II. They were the greatest or biggest power in the world for quite some time. Certainly in the Middle Ages, the British weren't really a power to consider. They were on England, and nobody really thought too much of them. It was only around the 1700s when the Industrial Revolution started to pick up steam, and certainly in the 1800s, where they fully capitalized on it, they were able to become one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. So that's certainly a big impact there. Now everyone is going to be learning English. They're going to be taking certainly English values. Certainly the practice of drinking tea is going to be spread throughout the world. And many of the technological achievements in science and other technologies is going to start in England and then spread because of their influence throughout the rest of the world. So certainly that is one impact. Probably some of the biggest impacts, though, for everyday Americans, but also Europeans and many other people around the world, is with industrialization, we have basically the Brit we know today, but also the Europe we know today, and certainly the civilization we know today. You look around, and many countries and businesses are producing products at a massive rate. Essentially, you have the start of consumerism. You have marketing, you have ads to try to sell that product. You have competition between companies to better your technology, to compete and have the better product out on the market. So this idea of capitalism also gets started here as well, which of course the United States, Britain, much of Europe has also bought into at this point as well. So you also have the transition from a cottage industry with people moving to the city, moving to factories, having a wage, and relying on that wage rather than what you produce on your own. And of course we see the effect of that all around the world today too. The concept of time is going to be developed. Transportation is going to be much, much quicker due to the development of the steam engine, which will result in the train, and then later on provide the foundation for the internal combustion engine, which will be the car and many trucks that we drive today as well. Certainly, going back to the industrialization and the factories, these safety measures that weren't taken are going to have a profound impact for many workers today. Due to the accidents and problems, there is going to be a series of reforms in the later half of the 1800s, both in Europe but also the United States, to try essentially make these machines safer, make the workplace safer, but also they're going to restrict working conditions for women as well as children, as they are seen as basically the future. They don't feel that they should actually be involved in essentially the factory and working. So the concept of a childhood starts to develop after the 1800s as well, due to these working conditions created here as well. But essentially, without the Industrial Revolution, the world wouldn't be the same. You're not going to see a Europe, a Western civilization. That certainly expands to the rest of the world. But this really defines what civilization will turn into, and you can see it everywhere around you. And this is certainly going to have a big impact on the competition for resources, competition for people, the markets, and that certainly is going to develop into what we see in the 20th century of the 1900s, starting off. Certainly, the biggest one being World War II. We're going to see the Great Depression, which is certainly impacted because of the Industrial Revolution, and World War II, and we have the Cold War, and so on and so forth. So we can see a variety of different impacts by the Industrial Revolution. You really just can't get away from how that changes complete society altogether. So that was just a relatively short overview of some of the more in-depth questions and developments about the Industrial Revolution. Hopefully this helps conceptualize what the Industrial Revolution means in its greater context. See you next time.